So my topic is the Kenyan middle class language and governance. Well, I am a linguist. What did you expect? As a lecturer at Moi University, my everyday is full of interactions with young people who've been described as the future of this country. But then, I look at this country, and like many Kenyans, I worry about the kind of a future and country my students will inherit. And I wonder how we got here, how it came to be that we, the middle class, are said to have let our country go. Today, I share with you my deliberations on this. I am a student, teacher, and researcher of linguistics, so language is the medium through which I view and make sense of the world. In using language to analyze the Kenyan middle class involvement in governance, I make use of the conceptual metaphor theory, which argues that human beings use metaphors to make sense of the world we live in, and that the language thereof is the realization of these attempts. This language, therefore, gives insight into how we perceive and conceptualize the world. I look at the language we use to discuss governance issues, tells us a lot about our preparedness and capability to engage in the push for good governance. So I started off with trying to figure out what the middle class is, and I looked up middle class in Google and tried to infer what the language used to report on this group of people portrays beyond the declaration of government agencies like the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics. 3 hits on the first Google page give an idea of the economic realities of the Kenyan middle class. In denial, middle class borrows to fund expensive lifestyle was a title was an article in the Daily Nation of Tuesday, June 4th, 2019. Middle class sinking in debt as bills mount. This is the reality of a Kenyan middle class, middle income household. That was a title in this Star on 11th of April, 2019. And we have another one here, why middle class Kenyans are living a lie. That was a title in the Standard of 30th of April, 2017. And these basically paint a truly dire picture of the so-called middle class from an economic point of view. Hence the persistent question, and I think Jadida already also brought it up, do we really have a middle class in Kenya from an economic point of view? And so I looked further on how else the middle class can and should be defined, and I found the rookie manager's breakdown of the social identifiers of the African middle class. I found them more inclusive. And they include people that have achieved tertiary education, so like we here, they hold professional qualifications, they include academics, lawyers, chartered engineers, politicians, and doctors, regardless of leisure and wealth. They hold salaried jobs and or are small business owners. They are young and in the acquisitive phase of life. They have fewer children, have strongly vested interests in their children's welfare, and they tend to opt for private healthcare and education. Yvonne just mentioned that about privately funded private education, and then they are aspirational. And I see, my casual observation in this room, I see we pretty much fit in here. And then I expanded these parameters to include people who have access to the internet, are competent in the use of social media, which means they can engage in social and political discourses, which of course include governance issues. This was an important addition for me because these are the people whose language I study, especially on the social media platforms, Facebook and Twitter, because this language tells us how we perceive governance, What are our sense of rights and responsibilities as citizens with regard to the government, public officers, etc. There's also the very Kenyan way of identifying the middle class by the neighborhoods we live in. It's an important factor because some public service providers map out the collective character of these neighborhoods, and it determines their service delivery. An example is that I once overheard Matatu crew talk of how complacent residents of Ruaka are. Do you know Ruaka? Limuru Road? That's where I live. And I once heard Matatu drivers, not drivers, but the crew, talking of how complacent we are, in that we just pay whatever they ask for. So what happens is that when the Matatus come from Ndenderu, which is further away from the city center, it costs 60 bob from Ndenderu to town, but when they get to Ruaka, it costs 70 bob. And the conductors know that Ruaka residents, just tell them it's 70 bob, they just pay. So they're actually surprised when you ask, how come it's 70? It's, 70 bob. So, so the middle class. So the question for me then is how it is that it has gotten this bad. The Kenyan middle class has often been accused of being the main reason things are as bad as they are in this country. We are said to be silent in the face of bad governance, in that we do not hold public officers accountable, we do not agitate for proper utilization of our taxes. We are often reminded of how the middle class has historically been influential in bringing about change, as in the case of the French Revolution. We hear this every day. And I agree, we the middle class have actively abated the horrid state of affairs in our country, paradoxically, by staying passive in the face of poor governance. But then I remember the words of Yvonne Adhiambo Awor, and I hope you all know her or have at least read her. And in her book, Dust, she writes, the too muchness of experiencing is why science is the language of last resort. And going by the aforementioned economic realities of the Kenyan middle class, that we are debt-ridden, we are sinking in debt, we are living a lie, it's all fickle and fake, middle class doesn't really exist, it's all just a mirage, then it becomes evident that it is all too not sinking. So we prioritize survival. As Yvonne just said, you're worried about, if I go out to demonstrate, then I'll lose my livelihood, I'll lose my job. So we prioritize survival. We even deliberately turn a blind eye to what is happening around us in the spirit of ignorance is bliss. And nowhere is this silence more evident than in public transport. This is my favorite topic because I see that this is where governance has just failed. So we are silent when one of us is bullied in a matatu for asking the driver to go slower and or abide by the laws of traffic. We are silent when one of us asks the crew to reduce the volume of the blasting music in a matatu. We are silent when the conductor arbitrarily decides that the fare has gone up, regardless of what that mbao said when we boarded the matatu. And we are silent when the conductors decide where and when to shukisha, regardless of where we're going. And we know how it ends. People are thrown to their deaths out of moving matatus. And silence breeds impunity. As a result, the public transport sector is the epitome of chaos because the players know that they'll get away with anything because Kenyans do not speak out. And this trickles over and up to other public offices. So police officers bully people on the streets every day because they know that Kenyans will keep minding their businesses. Public officers saunter in and out of their offices at will because Kenyans will be waiting patiently and saying nothing or only grumbling silently. Politicians will spew all sorts of nonsense on our time and tab because, well, Kenyans what I do. And the government blatantly goes against court orders and violently attack demonstrators that have every right and permit to fight for their rights. And yeah, silence is language. It is part of language. And we see what then happens when we remain silent. What happens then when we are forced to acknowledge what is happening, when silence is no longer an option? We combine language and graphics to trivialize the issues through jokes and memes. We've seen how our timelines on Twitter, Facebook, and our WhatsApps get lit up whenever the president gives yet another oppressive directive. I think one of the most overused emojis in Kenya must be the rolling on the floor with tears of laughter face. You know, humor is a well-proven deflection mechanism. And when we are not trivializing, we quickly make it clear that it's every man for himself. Kila mtu apambane na hali yake. It rings a bell, doesn't it? Yeah? Alternatively, we prattle around making statements that reek of resignation. You know, bora uhai, tutasurvive tu, itabidi uzoe, inauma, lakini we know how it goes. And this language is evidence of the struggle of the middle class to stay afloat. It is the outcome of years of all sorts of abuse from a system that is hell-bent on whipping us into shape. I go back to Yvonne Adhiambo, and she writes that after Mboya, Kenya's official languages became English, Kiswahili, and silence. There was also memory. Our collective and individual memories serve to feed our language and silence, and the state ensures that we remember. Do you remember the Huduma number drama of, was that last year or 2018? That was last year. Did you ever try to have a conversation with your parents on why it had to be taken, despite the fact that the government refused to clarify on why it was an urgent necessity, despite the fact that we are broke, we do not have money to pay doctors, we do not have money for a million other things, but Huduma number is a priority? I did. And my father's response was, nenda kachukue, huwezi shindana na serikali. Because he remembers. So we just follow orders and directives. We do not question. Memory feeds silence. Does it sound like I'm defending the middle class? I think I am. Because we keep getting hit on why we have failed and why we have led to the collapse of our country. Or, well, maybe not total collapse, but you get where I'm going. I think we might be expecting too much from a severely broken people. If I have had no power for a week, my dealings with Kenya Power will quickly shift from haki yetu to please, I don't want to go for another night without steam. Tafadhali, just fix it. Yeah? So fighting for my rights, trying to ensure that, I am pushed to a corner where I'm just fighting to just restore my power. When we watch the police gun down protesters, like in the case of Mwiki Kasarani 2 days ago, the courage to go to the streets for our rights fizzles out. I just want to live to fight another day. I just want to survive. I just want to stay afloat. Yes, we have a role to push for good governance. I agree. And we try to do it, but it quickly becomes clear that it is an exhausting, thankless job. I, personally, have been steadily tweeting Kenya Roads Board, Kura, Kiambu government, the Ministry of Transport and infrastructure, the minister, on the state of Limuru Road. It is horrible, and there are accidents pretty much every day because of the massive potholes that we have there. And I have never gotten a response from any of these public officers, from any of these agencies. Well, perhaps I do not have enough clout because, well, I am not, you know. And so, as a member of the middle class that keeps getting accused of doing nothing, I wonder what else I am supposed to do. Yeah? What's even worse is that fellow road users keep telling me to just drive slowly. You know, it's your responsibility to be careful on the road and avoid the potholes. Why are you prioritizing? Why are you more careful about your car and not being mindful of the other road users? So basically accusing me of negligence if I were to cause an accident, if I'm trying to evade a pothole. And honestly, right, and here's the best one, you know, use an alternative route. Someone has told me that I should use, I don't know what route, banana, what, to evade the potholes. And it's gotten to a point where I am now going to look for that road. And I really believe that it lies in education. I know we've said that one of the markers of the middle class is that they have an education. But this is not the education that I'm talking about. It's not the education that we should strive for. Novuyo Rosa Chuma, in her book House of Stone, tells us what kind of education this should be. In her words, to be any kind of a respecting vanguard, a man has to rid himself of the stifling confines of education, that top-down program enacted by a state to produce conservative men and women enthralled to its doctrines, be they tyrannical and unruly, and instead invest in an intimate relationship with knowledge. And in these days of information without or with only very limited borders, we've got no excuse to not search and find this knowledge. We have our very own, intellectual activists, people like Jerotich Sei, people like Kwandi Njoya, who are trying every day to deconstruct the government narratives, that we keep being fed to. We should listen to them and follow them and, engage in the fights that they are proposing. We owe it to ourselves and the future generations to rid ourselves of the government-driven miseducation. What must we then do? We must unlearn old ways in order to learn new ways. Chief Nyamweya recently wrote on the potency of unlearning fear in The Elephant. He argues that when we unlearn fear, we are empowered to challenge idiocy and cowardice, to liberate the courage of fellow human beings. When we shake off fear, we discover that the emperor's power was always contingent upon our complicity. And when we unlearn, we will also change the language that we use to discuss governance. In place of tunaomba serikali, we will insist tunadai haki yetu. And we will see how these will inspire us, not just the middle class, but basically the entire population. And then we will see that the middle class is taking up their role to engage in the push for good governance. Asanteni sana.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.